Hey guys, this is Chris from Record Talk. So I'm doing a contest for Michael Poetry on Plastic. And so he's got a few questions, and then he has what's going to be the longest part of my video is what he calls the letter to the editor. That we'll get to in a few minutes. So the first thing, he wants us to show a classical record. If you don't know him, he is a classical musician by trade. He's an oboist. And so I have a puny classical collection. I'm going to show this Andre Previn and the London Symphony Orchestra doing Vaughan Williams' Sinfonia Antarctica. I showed this video when I did a contest last year where I was trying to do all 7 continents. That was too complicated for people. This was my Antarctica record. So, heaviest sounding. So I'm going to take the liberty of changing your question slightly. This is going to be my heaviest record that has oboe on it. And so I'm going to show, I have it on CD. So this is the Metallica S&M record. And so this was Metallica performing with, I believe it was the San Francisco. Obviously, I should have looked up these details and made sure before starting the video. I believe it was with the San Francisco Orchestra. Yeah, San Francisco Symphony. And so it's the symphony accompanying Metallica. They're playing kind of a greatest hits of Metallica sort of setting. I enjoy it. I'm actually kind of curious if Michael watches the video and comments. As a professional classical musician, how do you feel about the idea of symphonies performing with rock musicians? Would that be something you would enjoy or dread doing? I've got to think there had to have been some of the people in the San Francisco Symphony who were probably not wild about this particular idea. Question 3, I'm going to pause because I forgot to get the record for it. Okay, I'm back. So the idea was to something you got into because of vinyl record collecting. And so I'm going to show, and there's obviously multiple examples of this. When you get in the vinyl community, you watch videos, you see people presenting stuff you haven't seen before. If you get into any of the VCLT, gift giving, trading, that sort of thing. So Russet Mama's Records gave me this CD by $75 bill called Wood Metal Plastic Pattern Rhythm Rock. And so this is a two-piece band with the guitar player plays kind of these microtonal sounds. It's very drone-ish, very much influenced by North African, particularly Mauritanian guitars. I actually have a Mauritanian record too that I'm not showing here. But then I did get this I Was Real album by them. So this is a double album that came up on Thin Wrist Recordings. And so there they are. And if I had never got into video making, I probably would still be completely unaware of this group that I really enjoy. Foreign non-English record. So I'm going to go the 7-inch route. I'm going to show this 4-song EP by this French crust hardcore band. There'll be a little bit more about post-hardcore as opposed to hardcore later. So Gas Mask Terror's the band. So the EP is called 1710-1961. So October 17th, 1961 was an infamous day in French history. A massacre of dozens, possibly hundreds of Algerians by the French police. And so this particular record has 4 songs on it. 2 of them happen to be in English, the songs Stab and Terrormongers, the other 2 in French, Octobre Rouge, Red October, and La Corde à Queue. I butchered the French, but obviously pretty political. The lyrics are pretty basic, whether it's the songs in English or the songs in French, but obviously heavily charged sort of material. A CD or tape that needs to be pressed on vinyl. Well, the regular viewers of my channel know that I'm a fan of Juliana Hatfield, sort of the alternative rock singer-songwriter from the Boston area. And you might notice the little Japanese obi here. I'm enough of a nerd that I have this the Japanese version of her 1998 album Bed. So this was her first full-length album after she left Atlantic Records and went back to being an independent artist. And one of the reasons to get the Japanese pressing, the Japanese version of the CD, above and beyond the coolness of the Obi, is that it actually includes a Please Do Not Disturb, which was a 6-song EP. So that's there along with the full album Bed, and 2 additional bonus tracks, Anemia and then Mean and Exit. Anemia is actually one of her better songs, and the Japanese version is the only one this is on. But I want this on vinyl because I want all of her stuff on vinyl. And I heard a rumor a couple years ago that the record company that she's currently working with wanted to reissue this on vinyl, and apparently they don't know. She doesn't know where the master tapes are for this. All right, letter to the editor. So what I did, Michael, Poetry on Plastic, is I went back and watched your entire video from January 2018 called Gimme 10 Post-Hardcore. So first of all, I'm 25 years older than you, so I didn't grow up and know much about most of these groups. Obviously, I probably know a lot of the hardcore bands before post-hardcore that would have influenced a lot of these bands. And even if you think back to like the mid-late 1980s, some of those weird SST bands, bands like SWA and Trotsky Ice Pick, and the like, were pretty quirky in and of themselves. Worm. I'm also wondering how much of a overlap there is going to be between math rock and post-hardcore. And I'm judging most of your bands just on the brief clips you showed, so this is total first impression land. So obviously I could be completely missing the target on some of these groups. So okay, so your first group you mentioned is the one I'm by far the most familiar with of anybody you mentioned, Fugazi. You mentioned the album Repeater. Notice I have the album. I saw Fugazi for $5 back in the day. I'm old enough for that. Obviously, I love them. I love Minor Threat, Rites of Spring. So this is a group I'm definitely familiar with. And then Refuse, The Shape of Punk to Come. So that came out in 1998. So by that time, late 1990s, I'm deep in grad school. In the early 2000s, I'm getting my career established as a professor. And while in the late 80s, early 90s, I was into the grunge, the Boston alternative scene. I did a jam band thing with a largely now ended Fish phase for a while. And let's see if I can regain the focus here. All right. I'm delightfully fuzzy. Refuse, The Shape of Punk to Come. Was not something I really listened to at that point of time, but it was definitely interesting. At the Drive-In. So I know the name At the Drive-In. I'm more familiar. I have a few albums by the Mars Volta. I know Cedric and Omar from At the Drive-In ended up obviously in the Mars Volta. You talked about the incredible energy of their live shows. So a band maybe more of my generation. I wasn't at the show, but I think of L7's 1991 show. There's a YouTube of it. It was from the Pop Underground Festival in Olympia, Washington. 50 minutes of those women just pedal to the metal with their sort of punk grunge style. They're yelling at all the stage divers. There's non-existent security. I never saw Nirvana live, but one of my roommates when I was in college did see them live, and he at a place called the Ogden Theater in Denver, and he just told me like the entire venue was just like a giant pit, and I wish I was there. Thursday, Full Collapse. That was the fourth one you mentioned, and that was the one you kind of let up with as well. That would have been one of my favorites based on the short clip I saw. Maybe I'll put that on my Discogs want list, even though I have somewhat more records than I need. The Blood Brothers, Burn Candle Burn. That one didn't really grab me much. The sixth one, The Sound of Animals Fighting. I'll be honest, I never heard of them. The name wasn't even familiar. The short clip reminded me a bit of Mars Volta, and I think you said it was 2004, so about the same era. And if this was the sort of stuff you were listening to when you were in middle school, you were definitely a more sophisticated kid than me. If I go back to like the early 1980s when I would have been in middle school, I had pretty mainstream taste. That was in sort of my post Kiss phase, my pre hair metal, classic metal phase, and then my pre punk, pre alternative, pre whatever I'm listening to up till then. But there was like Queen and Billy Joel and REO Speedwagon when I was in middle school. Number 7, Glassjaw. Another one new to me. It sounded closer to new metal than anything else you'd played so far, which would not be particularly a turn on for me. I'm not crazy about new metal as a genre, and I'm sorry if that comes across as insulting. It's not really what I meant, but the next one, The Fall of Troy Manipulator, that one sounded a lot more rocky to me, and based on the short clip, that was one of my favorites. Now, a band you didn't mention in your video, and I don't know if you're familiar with them. So Farraket, so they're from DC on the Discord label, which came out in 2000. Only full length record this band ever put out, and this was also something else I learned about because of the vinyl community. So Mr. Bizarro, Aaron, had played this on his live stream, and I liked it enough that you see, I bought it. Enter Shikari, that's another one that I'll be honest, I didn't like off the clip at all. The electronics, with the metalcore, seemed kind of mismatched. It didn't work for me. But again, maybe I could hear a different song, different album. Maybe I would think they're great. So I'm trying not to be too judgmental, even though I am. And then the last one, Fear Before the March of Flames. This seemed like a dichotomy as well, but a kind of a dichotomy I liked with the singer seemed pretty basic hardcore punk, but then the music was very sophisticated, experimental, post-rocky sort of music, and I kind of like that yin and yang of that going on. So again, that was been one of my favorites. And then the final thing I did is I looked into my Discogs and I typed in post-hardcore and see what came up. So Fugazi came up, Farraket, which I just showed, came up. Big Black and Husker Du came up, so those are both obviously groups from the 80s. Seems a little bit too early. Maybe that's proto-post-hardcore, if we want to make up totally ridiculous genre names. Also, I had a 7-inch single of a band called Breather Resist, who are from Louisville. I have this 7-inch from them from the year 2003, which... and I think this one sounds a bit like some of the bands you've described. I don't know if this was a group that you were ever familiar with, Michael. The guy named Evan Patterson, who was the leader of this Breather Resist, later on had a band more of the late 2000s, the Audis, called Young Widows, which is a bit more noise rock than post-hardcore. So I've gone on way too long already. But there we go. Contest entry for Michael, Poetry on Plastic, and some of my first impressions of post-hardcore based on some of Michael's favorite groups.